Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the whole wide world of clinical trials. As the session title suggests, we will be talking about clinical trials today. We'll be talking about what exactly a clinical trial is, how you might get involved with the clinical trial, and also what the experience might be like in a clinical trial. We'll also talk about clinical trial myths, because there are a lot of misconceptions around clinical trials. I would like this session to be interactive, so please interact with us and with others attending by using either the chat or the Q&A. You can leave comments there or questions. I would also like to remind everyone that this is an informational session, so if you are interested in joining a clinical trial or have questions about your specific condition or treatment path, please consult your healthcare team. Before I introduce the speakers on this panel, I will introduce myself as the moderator. My name is Dr. Darcy Flora, and I am Gryt Health's Chief Research Officer. I have spent nearly 20 years in research. I started out in molecular pharmacology, moved on to clinical pharmacology, and now with Gryt Health, I'm doing patient experience research. In addition to being a researcher, I also consider myself a patient, because as a young adult, I actually had the opportunity to participate in a phase 3 clinical trial for a new drug. And so for me, especially as a researcher now, that was an invaluable experience, because I was able to see the other side of the research from the patient perspective. I'm really excited about today's session, and I'm excited to introduce to you our 3 panelists. I'll have Megan Claire Chase go first, followed by Kelly Lashinger, and then Dr. Anita Kumar.
Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Claire Chase, Partnership Director for Gryt Health. I am also known as Warrior Megsy in the cancer community, because I am a 5-year stage 2A invasive lobular breast cancer survivor. I'm also a patient advocate. I'm known for my raw, sensitive, and humorous writing on my blog, Life on the Cancer Train. And you can see other published works on WebMD under their breast cancer section, or go to my About page and you can see other writing that's been published with different advocacy organizations. I'm also a research advocate, because I am a consumer reviewer for the Department of Defense Breast Cancer Research Program. What? I know. And also, I have a Megan Claire talk show on YouTube in collaboration with ancoraai. They are a clinical trial company where I help debunk some of those misconceptions that we're going to be talking about here today on clinical trials and spreading awareness.
Thanks, Megan. My name is Kelly Lashinger, and I am the manager of the Clinical Trial Support Center at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. My job here, and the job of the other nurse navigators in our center, is really to help patients navigate through their treatment options and the clinical trial landscape. We're educating them about their disease, treatment options, and potential trial options. We're really here to help them along the way with any barriers they may face. We work one-on-one with our patients to help them really, or their caregivers, throughout the course of their disease and treatment. So we really get to form relationships with our patients, and we're available at no cost to help other healthcare professionals, patients, caregivers find and answer questions about clinical trials. I'm also a certified pediatric hematology oncology nurse practitioner by training, and I worked at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio, in our pediatric and AYA cancer center for 18 years prior to coming to LLS. I had many roles over the years at Rainbow, including many years as the inpatient nurse practitioner on our general oncology unit, and I also was the survivorship and neuro-oncology NP, coordinating our multidisciplinary survivorship and neuro-onc clinics. So I'm really happy to be here with you all and with my fabulous panel partners today to talk all things clinical trials. I'll hand it to you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today. My name is Dr. Anita Kumar. I'm an oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. I am a lymphoma specialist, and so I care for patients who have Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphomas. I have a practice in our main center in New York City in Manhattan, and I also practice in New Jersey and central northern New Jersey in Basking Ridge. I am also a clinical investigator and a principal investigator for a number of different clinical trials. I'm really passionate about working together with my other research colleagues to try to move the field forward and offer patients novel therapies in the context of clinical trials that will hopefully lead to improved outcomes and better quality of life for our patients and families who face cancer diagnoses. And I'm also the medical director at our Basking Ridge, New Jersey site. And so in this leadership role, I'm really passionate about making clinical trials more available to patients who live in the community, who don't have perhaps the resources or ability to access clinical trials in tertiary or academic centers, but really bringing these cutting edge therapies and access to trials closer to home. So it's really wonderful to be able to be on the panel today with Megan and Kelly and to talk about clinical trials with you all. Thanks.
Thank you for those introductions. So I think we'll dive right in and just get at the heart of what is a clinical trial. And I think, Kelly, could you share what exactly a clinical trial is and why they exist?
Yeah, sure. So clinical trials are carefully controlled research studies. They're conducted by doctors, scientists, and researchers to either test new cancer treatments or to test treatments in new combinations or in different patient populations to see if these new treatments are really better in some way than the treatments we have approved and available today. So trials can be used to compare known treatments or standard of care treatments with new ones to find out which works better or is tolerated better by patients. Some trials are simply to explore patients' quality of life, how that may be improved. The goals of cancer clinical trials are really to help people live longer, to help them live better, and ideally to cure the disease that they have. Clinical trials are really crucial because it's really the only way that we know that a new treatment or combination of treatments really is more effective than the treatments we currently are using today. So clinical trials are critical in moving the science forward, as Dr. Kumar just said, in getting new and improved agents and treatments into the hands of our patients. All of the treatments that we use today were once in clinical trials, and that's actually how we got our standards of care.
That's great, Kelly. So a lot of times we'll hear, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and a lot of people have no context as to what that means. And I'll admit I myself had I participated in a phase 3 study. So can you explain kind of what that means?
Sure, yeah. So I like to think of clinical trials as steps to potential drug approval, and that's usually how I kind of explain it to patients. So all drugs have to move through the steps or phases to ultimately be approved by the FDA. If drugs are studied in new combinations or in diseases outside of the approved indication, the drug still must go through this clinical trials process to make sure that they're safe and effective in that new patient population or in that new combination. So each clinical trial has an extremely detailed plan laid out. It's called a protocol. The protocol must be followed to keep patients safe. Some clinical trials are offered at several cancer centers. This would be called a multi-site trial. But no matter where the clinical trial is taking place, the same protocol is followed at each site, again, to maintain the highest level of safety and monitoring of the patients. The slide that you're hopefully seeing is a nice graphic of the steps or phases of clinical trials. There we go. Typically, a cancer clinical trial is divided into 4 phases. So each phase is designed to answer a certain question. As each phase of the trial is successfully completed, the investigation of the drug can move on to the next phase. So phase 1 trials are safety trials. We're looking to determine the safe dose or maximum tolerated dose of a drug. These trials typically include only a small number of patients. And since phase 1 trials are looking to determine the safe dose of a drug, the first few patients who enroll may start with a lower dose of the drug that's being studied. If these first few patients tolerate the drug without showing significant toxicity, the next few patients will receive an increased dose and continue to be closely monitored for side effects and safety. So the patients that enter the phase 1 trial in the beginning of the study may get lower doses of the drug compared to patients that enter the trial later on. This is an important concept for patients to understand when thinking about joining a phase 1 trial. So if the drug is found to be safe and well tolerated, it moves on to phase 2, where we want to see if the drug is effective against a certain type of cancer. The dose determined to be safe in the phase 1 is the dose that we use in the phase 2 trial. And safety and close monitoring of side effects continues to really be the focus in a phase 2 trial as well. Phase 2 trials are a little bit bigger, and the group of patients is often more specific than in a phase 1 trial. So if the drug is deemed safe and effective, it moves on to phase 3, where we want to see if the drug or the treatment being studied is better in some way than the treatments we currently have today. That could be less acute or long-term toxicity or side effects, or maybe the medicines are better tolerated, or we could be looking at longer progression-free survival or overall survival. The drugs may be approved by the FDA after a phase 3 trial. Phase 3 trials are often randomized and enroll lots of patients, so hundreds to thousands of patients. And randomization, I always like to explain that to patients too, really means that there's more than one treatment arm in the trial, and that the patient is assigned to one of the arms randomly, like flipping a coin. So there's often a control arm, which is the standard of care therapy arm, and then an experimental arm, which is the arm with the new treatment being studied. And neither the doctor nor the patient get to pick the arm the patient is treated on in a randomized trial. And then there's phase 4 trials, which continue to study the drug or the combination of drugs after the FDA has approved them, just to get continued long-term safety data or long-term disease response information.
Great, thank you. Could you comment a little bit on how long this takes? Because I think a lot of people have a misconception of how quickly research progresses. And I think even just looking at, development of like COVID vaccines, that has given kind of a misconception even more, I think, of how fast drugs typically move through the development process.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And Dr. Kumar can jump in here too. There's different designations that drugs can get for different reasons, in talking about the COVID vaccine and kind of this emergency designation, or there's different ways that drugs can kind of get into the hands of patients. Sometimes they're not going all the way through this stepwise through this large randomized phase 3 trial. But each trial, so phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, those are all separate trials. It's not like it happens, phase 1 through 3 is not all in one protocol. They're kind of their own separate trials within the phases. And it really just depends on how the trial is set up and how the protocol is written. Each study really has a predetermined length of treatment time spelled out in the protocol. So the patient should have a good idea of the length of time that they will be required to be involved in that trial. Some trials will continue for several years to follow patients, into survivorship to see how they're doing. And all that should really be spelled out in the consent and in the protocol for the patient. But moving a drug from phase 1 through phase 2 through phase 3 to drug approval is years. It can take a long time, and it really depends on lots of different reasons for that, but it can take a long time.
I definitely would echo what Kelly said, that this process is a long process, and from the time of the first testing of a particular molecule or new drug in the laboratory to then animal testing and then first in human studies and phase 1 through 3 studies and then to FDA approval many times can take over a decade. And so actually participation in clinical trials can be an opportunity to potentially get early access to a novel therapy before it's gone through that rigorous process of ensuring that the drug is effective and safe. And so for many of the for example, in my field, rituximab, which is an anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, an immunotherapy that has now become standard of care. It was first developed actually in the lab in 1991, and then, it didn't end up becoming FDA approved for the treatment of non-Hodgkin lymphoma until 2000. Or so. And so, it has taken many years for it to become treated, or to be utilized. And oftentimes the drugs are used first in patients who have, what we call, relapsed or refractory disease, meaning their cancer is more advanced and they've already been treated with multiple lines of therapy. But it can take even more time for that same drug to be tested in combination with standard therapies for newly diagnosed patients. And so participating in a clinical trial may not mean that you're seeing the drug for the first time that it's been utilized. It may have actually been used extensively in other trials, but participating in a clinical trial may give earlier access to it in that particular phase of the cancer trajectory. So I think the COVID vaccine story is very different, to your point, Darcy, than how we think about testing for cancer drugs. It's oftentimes a much longer process.
Great, thank you both for those explanations. And Dr. Kumar, you had mentioned in the beginning that you are a principal investigator. I think that's a word that a lot of people are probably unfamiliar with. Do you mind speaking a little bit about that and what exactly it means? Yeah, absolutely. So a principal investigator is sort of the lead researcher or the primary person who is responsible for the conduct of a clinical trial. There are a variety of different roles that a principal investigator serves. Oftentimes as a PI, as we call it, we actually are involved in the design of the study and in the early conception phase. And this actually can take quite a long time. We work closely with scientific partners, with pharmaceutical companies to ensure that the way that we have designed a clinical trial is in the patient's best interests, that we protect the safety of the patients, and that we ensure that if a patient participates in this study, at the end of that study, we will hopefully have advanced the field in terms of better understanding how that drug works, its safety profile, and if it's an effective therapy for a given disease. Once the protocol has been conceived of, then, or the study has been conceived of, then we write what is called a clinical trial protocol, which Kelly had mentioned previously, which is oftentimes a document that's around 50 to 100 pages, which is extremely detailed with regard to what patients are eligible for the study, what is the rationale for the study, how does this fit into the landscape of therapies that are available for this disease. What do we hope to answer? What are the questions that we are asking with this trial, and what do we hope to answer? And do we have a valid statistical design so that we really do answer those questions? So there's a detailed biostatistical plan that drives how many patients are enrolled in the study. Can we answer the question with 20 patients, or do we need 1,000 patients involved in this clinical trial to answer the question that we're asking?
It also details what are the drugs that are being utilized in the clinical trial, what is the safety profile, what do we know about that drug at that dose level, and provides very detailed instructions for anybody who is participating in that trial. So say an investigator in a different state puts somebody on that trial from where the principal investigator is, they know exactly how to treat that patient. They know exactly what visits, what assessments will be done, from labs to imaging to safety assessments all along the way. So as a principal investigator, I have a research team that I work with. We meet multiple times a week to monitor how the patients are doing on our studies. One of the really central aspects of being a PI is being responsible for the safety of all of the patients on your study. And so I'm always alerted about any emerging new toxicities that are being reported for patients on our study. And we take monitoring of that very seriously. And sometimes we might see a new emerging toxicity and say, you know what, we need to halt enrollment on this trial. We need to rethink, maybe change the dosing, change the combination. And oftentimes this will involve a multiple regulatory steps, working with our institutional review board at our local institution, and also with the sponsor and the FDA in many cases. Being a PI is a very exciting job because we get to be a part of, designing clinical trials that hopefully will move the field forward. But there is a lot of oversight and hard work that goes in to ensuring that patients who are enrolled on studies and who decide to participate, that we are protecting their safety at every step of the way.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. I just saw a question come into the chat around, is there only one PI per trial? Would you be able to comment on that?
Yes, so typically there's, it depends on how the study is designed. In some cases, there may be one PI and then a co-PI, like a clinical investigator who's closely involved. If the PI, for example, is away on vacation, they would step in, things like that. But there can be trials which have multiple PIs across many sites. And so oftentimes to do this type of research, especially in rare diseases, where we may not be able to enroll enough patients at one site, and also to ensure that we're really trying to enroll a diverse group of patients across various geographies and well represented across a disease, it can oftentimes be more powerful to have a national or international even experience to make the results of that clinical trial more generalizable. And so in those cases, for larger studies, there would be multiple PIs.
Great, thank you. And I know you touched a little bit on just, obviously clinical trials are very regulated and there's a lot of safety considerations that go into them. Can you comment on the type of care patients that are in clinical trials can expect to receive? And then Megan Claire, I would also love to hear kind of you jump into as your perspective from caring for your mother.
Absolutely. So I'll start here, but agree it would be great to get the perspectives of Megan and Kelly as well. In terms of the care that patients receive on clinical trials, the first step is really ensuring that a patient understands what it means to participate in a clinical trial. That's what we call the process of informed consent. And that means that patients really understand what are the treatment options that are available to them at that juncture in their care. And so there are oftentimes standard treatment options that may be available in addition to the clinical trial option. And so we try to really describe what are the differences in the different treatments that are available, and what is the question that we're trying to answer with that clinical trial. What are the benefits to participating and what are the potential risks? And it's really important that patients understand that before deciding to participate. We do believe that care in the context of a clinical trial is really very comprehensive and is very detail oriented, because as we mentioned before, we need to make sure that everyone who participates in that trial is getting the exact same care, the same assessments, and that they're being carefully monitored while on the treatment program. And so one of the potential positive aspects about participating in a clinical trial is that you have a dedicated clinical team who has experience with that protocol, who's caring for you. Oftentimes in my clinic, I have a clinical trials nurse who is specialized in lymphoma, who's specialized in the clinical trials that, they're enrolling patients on. So they really have a very intimate knowledge of what are the emerging toxicities, what are things to expect. It's also really important that patients have the same type of assessments. In a standard of care circumstance, a patient may, get labs once a week in one office, or, once a month in another office. There may not be one standard approach. In contrast, in a clinical trial, everybody gets the same assessments. So we have to make sure that we are doing the labs, the imaging, et cetera, in a very standard format. And that is designed prior to the development of the clinic, the opening of the clinical trial, to again ensure the safety of the patients. So I really think the care is very, as I said, comprehensive and detail oriented, and very patient centered when a patient participates in a clinical trial.
I'd have to agree with you, Dr. Kumar. With my mother being in a clinical trial, I have noticed that the amount of care and oversight, and when she's had some reactions to some of the medication, that they have a special number for her to call if she's having severe side effects. So I feel like she's really being taken care of. And that actually comforts me, because it took me a while to even warm up to the idea of clinical trials. So I think it's also important to note that you don't have to be stage 4 to be considered for a clinical trial as well. So I think a lot of people think that you're not going to get any type of care once you get into a clinical trial, but they will always make sure, as you mentioned before, that there is a standard of care. So just seeing the attentiveness and making sure that everything is okay and they're monitoring her, I feel comfortable that she's in this clinical trial.
Kelly, I don't know if you have any comments on this.
I think everything, Megan and Dr. Kumar said, that's, kind of my view as well. I really feel like one of the benefits to being on a clinical trial is this care that you receive that's, just so dedicated to the patient, so patient-centric. With things going on with COVID too, we've seen some opportunities too where we've gotten some local labs drawn, or been able to do some visits, online instead of having to travel to the sites. And there's been some good changes there too that hopefully we can carry through. And really the other benefit, I always see to being on a clinical trial for patients is that you have access to these drugs before they're available, to patients outside of the trial, and you have access to experts. I mean, Dr. Kumar and these PIs that are in charge of these trials study these rare diseases. That's what they do every day, all day. So just getting access to these expert physicians is really a benefit as well. And nursing too, just like Dr. Kumar said, the whole team is all in on this trial, knows all things about it, and it's really expert level care.
Thanks for pointing that out, Kelly, because that is true. I mean, PIs are really considered experts in their field, and that's why they're leading these trials. Megan Claire, you had mentioned both in our kind of prep meeting and then just now how your feelings towards clinical trials have changed over the years. And so curious to hear more about that and kind of, what your initial concerns were and what has really led to that change.
Well, I mean, we live in a world where skin color has subjected Black people to centuries of oppression, discrimination, and I think a lot of people especially those who are white, tend to forget that a lot of this atrocity to Black bodies in particular was not that long ago. And there really hasn't been, I think, a major effort to really work on building that trust, because we have to first acknowledge the past, but the past was not like, a million years ago. Because we all know about the story of Henrietta Lacks with her cells being taken without her consent, and of course the syphilis project that we know of, but I think of all of the other ones that we haven't heard about or that haven't received that kind of notoriety, and that is concerning. And so for me, like the fact that medical students are still being taught that Black skin is tougher and can handle pain better, when you still have these archaic and racist things being taught to doctors, and then it makes you wonder, well, how can I trust them to put me in a clinical trial that's going to supposedly help me? So I had a lot of skepticism regarding clinical trial, because I also worried that I wouldn't get any treatment. Like, there are just so many myths and the misconceptions. I was honestly under the belief for the longest time that, oh my God, what if I just get a placebo and I'm the one that's going to be in pain and no one's going to recognize it? But as I've done more research and have gotten more involved in understanding clinical trials, I was like, oh, okay, you'll never be without care. And I don't think that the mass of people know that. And that's something that we need to talk about more, especially in the oncology setting. But it's just hard when you already have a difficult time trying to build that trust and be seen by your doctors, and then to go into something that is experimental. You really do have to have a talk with yourself and say, okay, I'm doing this for science, I'm doing this for my body, and I'm hoping it works, because there is a level of fear involved as well. But ultimately, those were my original concerns around clinical trials. But I'm happy to say that I'm actually even looking for a clinical trial for myself, and I never would have even said that 2 years ago.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for bringing up those points, because those are really important, and developing that trust is so essential to be able to progress science. What kind of recommendations would you have for people that are kind of feeling similarly to how you were feeling a couple of years ago?
Honestly, it's really about doing research and asking questions, and also know that you matter. I'm excited to know that more conversations are starting to be had with the different underrepresented communities. And I'm just hoping and encouraged also that this continues to happen. But I think first, instead of talking at patients in these underrepresented populations, that we need to talk with them and really understand each of their ancestry and things that have happened within their communities, to better form questions and better build that trust. So we'll be more open to hearing about it, but also understanding some of this terminology. As I listened to Dr. Kumar and Kelly, these medical terminology just rolls off the tongue. Well, to someone maybe in an area where they don't have a lot of education, it's going to sound foreign to them. So it's really meeting patients where they are, first of all, but also explaining the definitions of all the different parts of clinical trials and getting that out there. I think that's a problem too, because there's so much misinformation. Is if we could have a breakdown of the terminology where patients, no matter what their education level is, could understand, I think that would be a huge help too, because that might eliminate some of that fear.
Thank you so much, Megan, for sharing that. And it's an important reminder, as an oncologist, that, like you said, we have to have these open conversations, because we have a lot of assumptions kind of based on our own training. And, like you said, even the way we speak about these topics, it's almost like a different language. And so I really appreciate that, reminder to kind of sometimes we'll have patients say, I'm not interested in clinical trials, but we do need to have the follow-up question to say, why is that? What are your fears? Where does that come from? And so thank you for that. I see in the chat, and that was something you mentioned too, about this concept of, am I going to get no care, if I go on a clinical trial, and a lot of fear around placebo. And I think that's something I'd just like to address. I know we had talked, it was in a section of our myths and misconceptions about clinical trials as well. But we do not include sugar pills or standard placebos in clinical trials for cancer patients. That would never be acceptable. It would never be ethical to do that. So in all, cancer clinical trials, patients are either receiving the best standard of care that's available, or they're receiving, an investigational or new treatment approach. And oftentimes, at least in my field, we will build upon a treatment that is already known to be highly effective and then add something to that. So for example, we have one standard treatment that has been associated with curing a proportion of patients who have aggressive non-Hodgkin lymphoma is a treatment called R-CHOP. And that is the standard of care. That's what we would give to all patients. But unfortunately, that program doesn't cure all patients with these types of lymphomas. And so a lot of the clinical trials have actually been designed in a randomized fashion to give half patients standard R-CHOP, what they would get anyway, or R-CHOP plus a new drug. And that is actually how a lot of our trials are designed, so that you either get the accepted standard of care, what you would be getting otherwise, or the accepted standard of care plus a novel drug that we think is going to add benefit to that established treatment program. Alternatively, a lot of our phase 2 and 3 trials will not even have a standard of care arm. They will just, all patients will be treated with the novel therapy program. And so I think that it's really important to emphasize that for the world of cancer and oncology, you will never be on a treatment arm which involves no treatment or just getting a sugar pill. So hopefully that clears up some of the myths around clinical trials, but certainly it's a very understandable fear.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kumar, for addressing the placebo, because I was also seeing a lot of questions around placebo. I think we have some slides on some common myths around clinical trials. So if we could bring those up and talk about those, that would be great.
So this very cute picture of a guinea pig. The question here is, if I enter a clinical trial, I'll be treated like a guinea pig. And I think this gets to some of the things that Megan had brought up, that, am I really going to be treated fairly? Is this something that is just benefiting the researchers who have a question that they, want to ask? And am I a potential vulnerable subject who could potentially be taken advantage of? And, as we tried to explain in further detail, this process of doing clinical trials in the modern era is one where beneficence, or caring for the patient and doing what's best for the patient, is really at the very center of what we think about when designing an ethical and appropriate clinical trial. And so we really are interested in protecting patients who decide to participate in clinical trials. So we really believe that this statement is false. And if you can just move along with the slides. As we discussed, there is a strict set of rules and regulations really designed to protect patients and to protect their, quality of care and their safety. And I think that one of the things that is in my own practice that I try to do is to give patients a copy of the informed consent document, which really details a lot of the risks versus the benefits, and kind of goes through the rationale for the study and what are the potential benefits, but what are also the potential risks and side effects. And I usually always encourage patients to take a copy of that home, to read it over, to write down, take a highlighter, take a pen, circle everything you don't understand. I mean, we do design the informed consent forms at a, 6th grade reading level to try to avoid us using too much medical jargon that will go over people's heads. But nevertheless, there can sometimes be medical jargon in the informed consent. And so I really encourage people to sit down with their family members, to ask their friends and family who might have had similar experiences, to try to think about the trial together and then come back for a next visit with all of their questions. And really the research team and myself, the nurses, we really try to answer all of those questions before somebody decides to participate in a trial, because we never want them to feel like, they're just a test subject and there's not a benefit for them, and that they don't fully understand the protocol. But I'd love to hear, Megan and Kelly, if you have other thoughts on that concept.
No, I think that was perfect. I agree.
Just move along with the other myths. Yeah. So I think we talked about this one, the placebo. This is definitely false. You just move along with the slides here. So like we said, you either receive the accepted treatment, which is the standard treatment protocol, or a new treatment that's being studied, but not just a placebo alone or no care. Next. Clinical trials are the treatment of last resort. And I think Megan brought this up very nicely, that this is not just for stage 4 or the most advanced patients who've exhausted every standard option. In fact, many of the patients we put on trials are patients who have a new diagnosis of cancer, and we are trying to give them access to some novel therapies that have already demonstrated promise within the field. If you could just move ahead here. So, like you said, many different patients can be eligible for trials, patients who have a new diagnosis or even have limited stage disease, like early stage disease. There are many different indications for trials. Some trials are actually non-therapeutic trials where patients are not necessarily subject to getting new drugs. They can be trials where we're trying to understand, are there different laboratory markers or new imaging markers that could be associated with understanding outcomes for patients in cancer or early detection of cancer. There are also various quality of life trials that we might do where we're trying to really focus on patients' symptoms and how do we optimally manage patients' symptoms as they arise. So there are a variety of different things that we take into account when thinking about the eligibility for patients at various stages of the cancer trajectory. And then care and treatment received are free in the context of clinical trials. So I think this is a very important concern. This is both true and false because when we design clinical trials, oftentimes the novel drug that is not yet FDA approved is provided at no cost to a patient. If you could just advance the slide, thank you. On the other hand, there are many other costs that are covered by a patient's health insurance. And so that would be what we would consider standard of care. That might be the imaging studies that we do, the laboratory evaluations, or the clinical visits, which might be similar to what we would do with standard of care. One of the things that does end up creating additional costs for patients is travel time. So you may need to come for additional visits to see the doctor. Sometimes you might need to stay overnight because you have to start your treatment at 7 a.m. in the morning. You may need to go to an alternate site to get a specialized test or biopsy. And so there are actually many clinical trials that are designed with travel or alternate cost reimbursements for patients. So it's very important as a clinical trial participant to ask about that, because there may be opportunities to reimburse patients for various additional costs that can be associated with participating in the clinical trial. And I'd definitely like to pass this over to Kelly too, because the LLS has supported many of my patients to have access to clinical trials by providing additional financial and other resources to patients who are going on clinical trials.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's many resources available for a patient. So like Dr. Kumar said, sometimes the local cancer center has low cost lodging options. Some centers will have a Ronald McDonald House or a Hope Lodge, or have some contracts with hotels around the hospital that can offer kind of offset or low cost lodging. And then also the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company that makes the drug being studied can also sometimes offer these stipends for patients or caregivers that are traveling for a trial. And like Dr. Kumar said, it really just depends on the trial, but it's always good to ask. You've got to ask the study coordinator at the cancer center where the trial's taking place, if there are funds available both from the cancer center and from the sponsor. And then there's many organizations that offer assistance to patients. LLS does have a travel fund for our blood cancer patients. The American Cancer Society, Lazarix, Alex's Lemonade Stand for those that are under 21. Those are a few others that have funding available for travel too. And really, I always tell our patients, like, they can use all of these resources. So it's important that they know that these things are available, and they really need just to know who to ask to help them get assistance from a variety of sources. So you can get assistance from the sponsor of the trial, get the low cost lodging at the cancer center, and then also come to LLS and get some travel assistance too, because these things really can add up. Like Dr. Kumar said, if you're having to stay away from your home for, a month, and, families have other things going on. You're missing work. You have childcare situations. There's just so many other costs that can pile up. So really, I just encourage the best person to talk to about financial assistance is likely the social worker at the cancer center where they're being treated, or the trial nurse coordinator or nurse navigator at the cancer center where the trial is at. And they will often be able to help the patients get connected to resources both locally and then from these larger nonprofit, organizations as well. But it definitely takes a village, and there are certainly resources out there, and LLS is definitely here to help.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we quickly touch on how people can even find a clinical trial, and what they should be asking their healthcare team. And then if we could get to a couple questions right before, because I know we're starting to run out of time.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. So I think we said that, how do we find a clinical trial, just kind of in general. There's lots of ways to do this. First, it's always talk to your healthcare providers, talk to your doctors, your nurse practitioners, nurse navigators, your family, your friends. And even if your team of providers has not mentioned clinical trials to you, I would encourage you to advocate for yourself and to ask them if there's opportunities for you to participate in a trial, if that's something that interests you. Really, this conversation about clinical trials should take place early in your diagnosis and treatment, and really often, because as we've said several times, there's trials throughout the disease spectrum. Newly diagnosed, relapsed, refractory, even maintenance trials. So really talking about this often with your healthcare providers, I would really encourage that. Many hospitals and larger cancer centers have their clinical trials posted oftentimes like on their website. So you can find some trial resources there. And then there's patient organizations, obviously, that can help patients learn more about clinical trials. We've talked a lot about LLS in the unique service that we provide in the Clinical Trial Support Center. So our nurse navigators are here to help patients, caregivers, healthcare providers identify trials and really overcome any barriers they might face. And then, of course, there's this thing called clinicaltrials.gov, which is just a huge, large database that houses all of the clinical trials worldwide. And patients can certainly get information there. It's difficult for patients to navigate. It is maintained by the National Institute of Health and updated by PIs and sponsors. So the information is out there, I guess, is the bottom line. But it's difficult for patients to navigate. Things can be confusing if you're trying to look at clinicaltrials.gov and not having a medical background. The process of searching for a trial really can be complicated and exhausting for patients and caregivers. But I think what we really want you to know is that there's resources out there, and just really encourage you to talk to your healthcare providers, and joining in discussions like this, just really helping to raise awareness and get you guys to be comfortable to have these conversations.
I would also like to add clinicaltrials.gov. It's very convoluted. It is a difficult site. So I wanted to share another one that has been helpful for me and some other patients. It's called ancoraai. And I like that it's really patient friendly. There are FAQs on there so you can understand. So they're getting that information from clinicaltrials.gov, but putting it in a way that you can understand. But I also don't want the onus to totally be on the patient to have to always mention clinical trials. So I do think it is an important discussion between your provider as well. But I think it's just important to know that your health matters. Every body is different, which is why clinical trials exist, and which is why we really need people of color to learn about clinical trials and be told about clinical trials, or be helped to understand what it is they're finding for clinical trials. Because I will just tell you really quick that for me, the only reason why I'm really gung-ho about clinical trials now is because I'm literally on no medication to help prevent recurrence for my breast cancer, because my body was intolerant. And it was at that moment that I realized this medication was not tested on Black women or those that have a mixed heritage. And it really just made sense to me. So we need more people of color to be open to the possibility of it. And so medications will work because every body is different.
Yeah. And I love that you said the onus is not just on the patients. It's so true. And, Dr. Kumar and I and other providers, that's part of our role too. You're a provider, but you're also a teacher. And so to, the new docs and residents and nurses and everyone, coming up, it's up to us to teach them the importance of doing this for patients too. So I love that you said that.
Me too.
Thank you so much for all those comments. I'm just going to add one question and then we'll wrap up. One of the questions that came through the chat are study participants followed for the rest of their life for long-term side effects?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. There can be clinical trials which have a set period of follow-up, which can be determined based on the primary endpoint for the study. Like, for example, the primary endpoint might be how are patients doing 3 years after they finish treatment. And then typically the clinical trial team would continue to follow all patients out till that time point. You would continue to, of course, receive care with your primary oncologist even after no longer officially being a part of the clinical trial. And if you had any long-term, new toxicities or issues, you should report it to your oncologist, who then could inform the investigators for the trial. Increasingly, there are now more and more longer term follow-up studies. Sometimes you can actually go from a primary therapeutic trial to then a long-term monitoring trial, because I think there is increased awareness that patients can have some set of toxicities when they first start a drug, but if you've been on it for 5 years, there may be a new set of toxicities that begin to emerge. And so it's important to capture that. And it's also important to know not only how patients do right after the treatment, but also how they do over a longer course of time. You might cure them of the disease, but they may have new medical issues that come up that could be related to the treatment that emerge 10 or even 20 years down the line. So we do try to follow patients over time.
Great, thank you so much. This information was all wonderful. And thank you for everyone that has attended. I do want to mention that GVCC is not over. There are more sessions later today and throughout tomorrow. In particular, I think at 3 p.m. Eastern, we have 2 sessions that are starting. One, I'm metastatic, now what? And the other one is unmasking the cancer experience, what COVID means for cancer patients. So I would encourage you to attend when this Zoom ends. Please go back to GVCC21.com. You can log in, and then from the homepage, you'll see the button that says happening now. Thank you.